Well, last week we started a new sermon series called Address the Mess. And while each of these sermons in this series stand on their own, I want to encourage you, if you miss any of them along the way, to check out the app or to check out our online website where you can listen to or watch previous sermons. Because while each of these messages stands on its own, they do kind of build on one another, and each one of them is important to the whole picture. For example, last week we started talking about what it looks like to address the mess, and what I said was, in this series, we're not going to talk about how we can solve or address every single mess that we encounter as human beings. If we did that, this sermon series would never end, right? We could just call that church. But this series, what this series is intended to do is it's intended to look at the big picture. It's intended to look at how we address the messes that we get into and how we walk alongside others who find themselves in a mess. And one of the reasons that we need to look at this is because often, in as much as the messes mess up our life, sometimes the way we address the mess can mess up our life. It can mess ourselves up as we try to address the mess within us, and we can mess up someone else if we try to address their mess in a way that isn't really good or helpful. So we're talking big picture here. And the good news for us is that when we look at the life of Jesus Christ, when we look at the message of the Gospels and what he did and what he teaches, we find some very clear examples of how Jesus instructs us and how he teaches us by example how to address the mess, both personally and with others who are in our lives. For example, last week we learned that Jesus says when we're going to address a mess, the most important thing we can do is to first address the mess in the mirror. That we don't get to start picking on anybody else's mess until we address our own mess. And the language he used was, before you take that speck out of your neighbor's eye, make sure to remove the plank out of your own eye. And there's a couple reasons that Jesus wants us to do this. The first reason is because when we recognize that we are a mess and that we've been in messes and that we are broken, it helps us to not be so judgmental for those who are in a mess of their own. Because when we remember first and foremost that we are just like them and that we've messed up too, it keeps us from being judgmental. The second thing that can happen when we address the mess first in this way is it allows us to, with authenticity, walk along someone else who's struggling with their own mess. Because if you're in a mess and I'm walking alongside you and you think I'm perfect and I pretend like I'm perfect, then it can make you feel like you're all alone in the messiness of this world. And that's not how things work. But if you know that I've been there too, then I can walk alongside you with authenticity and grace, and you don't have to worry about impressing me with your perfection. And this is one of the hopes that I have as we walk alongside each other, as we sort out the messes of our life, is that together we can find the blessings that come from brokenness. And I use that word intentionally, because if we let God break into the broken parts of our lives, we can experience tremendous blessing in that. Remember, the beauty of our faith is not found in perfection. The beauty of our faith is not about perfection. The beauty of our faith is found in redemption. The beauty of our faith is found in that brokenness that we all share, that does not condemn us, but that gives us the opportunity for redemption and health and new life through Jesus Christ. We all share this in common. The challenge, though, is that in order to really experience this, we've got to own our own brokenness, and that can be really hard to do. Have you ever met anyone who likes to be told that they're wrong? I mean, I've met a couple people who claim to like to be told that they're when they're wrong, and I said, well, I think you're wrong about that, and they were maybe not so glad that I said that, but maybe there's a few of you who really don't mind being told when you're wrong. But there's another thing that I've noticed is that people don't like to be told that they're sinners. Now, I don't mean in the broad sense. You've heard me say that so many times that you probably can't count, right? It's not offensive to you if I say, well, we're all sinners and we're all broken. What is offensive and what is harder is if I sit down with you and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this one sin that I've seen in you. Because if you want to get right with God, you need to fix this one sin, and this sin is really getting in the way of that, and I think you got to get over it, right? I just want to let you know I've never done that. One of the reasons I've never done that is because I know what would happen if I did do that. You wouldn't like it. And odds are you might not come back because you wouldn't feel like this is a safe place for you in your brokenness. But here's a problem with church, and it's a problem that maybe you've experienced before, is that sometimes, even with the very best intentions, when we try to address the mess of this world by talking about how we need to be perfect and good and right and all those kinds of things, sometimes the language that we use when we talk about what good Christians are, sometimes the language that we use in those moments is language that can make other people feel condemned. It can make them feel like there's no place for them here because they're not good enough. They're not perfect enough. They're not faithful enough. And unfortunately, the church over time has been a place where many people have experienced that they can't walk into the doors of a church safely because if the church knew what was really wrong with them, the church would condemn them. Remember last week I showed you the pictures of my basement? Some of you who saw that, you'll never get that image out of your mind, will you? Right? It's bad. It's bad. Amen. But here's the thing. We do this with our own personal stuff too, right? We try to hide that stuff too because we're afraid if the world knew that our personal basements look like my literal basement, we might feel some condemnation. But I need to tell you that that's not the message of Jesus. It doesn't matter if that's the message of the church, and it doesn't matter if Christians are preaching that message. I am telling you, it is not the message of Jesus. You're probably familiar with John 3:16, right? And you've probably seen posters with people who hold up a poster. In fact, when you watch God's team today defeating the Green Bay Packers, okay, you will see, I got to tell you, this is pretty good. I got to tell you this in between services because I've been rolling that out all day because I'm a little excited about the Dallas Cowboys today. They're going to win. But when I called them God's team, which I always do, today I heard the best comeback. Someone said, Dallas isn't God's team. Cleveland is God's team. And I was like, well, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And Albert Zimmerman said, the last shall be first. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. If you don't know Albert, he's a huge Cleveland Browns fan. And so, you know, that you want to talk about a way of making lemonade out of lemons. That is it. So you've probably seen that poster where people just hold it up, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son in order that we may have salvation, right? It's a powerful story. God so loved the world in spite of all the messes of the world that instead of condemning the world, which God could have done, instead of destroying and punishing the world, which God could have done, God decided instead to send love and grace in the world in the form of Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world. It's no wonder that we celebrate that passage. But do you know what passage comes after John 3:16? John 3:17. That's right. It's not just that that's what comes after. It's what's in John 3:17. I'm telling you, I think that the words of John 3:17 are every bit as important as John 3:16. And if we read John 3:16 without 3:17, we have the potential of becoming that judgmental, condemnatory church that people often think of Christians as being. This is John 3:17. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world may be saved through him. I want to read that first part again because it's so very, very important. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world. You hear that? Jesus did not come into this world to condemn this world. Jesus came into this world to offer the hope and the grace that is a salvation that can be found only through him. I don't know how Christianity became this place where people are often taking up the mantle of righteous salvation by condemning others for their sins, by creating Christianity into this place where there's insiders and outsiders, where it feels like people have to be shamed into believing in Jesus Christ, because that's not the message of Christ. Whenever you hear someone condemning someone else, They are not walking in the footsteps of our Savior, because Jesus did not come into the world to condemn the world. Neither should we then condemn anyone in the world, because that is not the story of our faith. And I want to say something to anyone who's ever been shamed, anyone who's ever been condemned, anyone who's ever been afraid, that if the church knew what was in your basement, in the basement of your life, that if the church knew that this would not be a safe place for you, that you don't belong in the church because of what you've done or who you've been or what you've said or didn't do, if you've ever felt that the church was an unsafe place for you, I'm so sorry. I really am. Because this is supposed to be the safest place for you. And I want to give you some examples of why I say that. I'm not just saying that. I'm going to tell you some stories today about some people in Scripture who deserve to be condemned. In fact, for one of them, the law demanded that she be condemned. But Jesus had a different message. You may have heard these stories before, but I just want you to hear them again because they're so important, and they tell us how we can help address the mess in a way that's so grace-filled. Jesus was walking through the city of Jericho one day, and a great crowd formed around him. And there was a guy who wanted to see him but couldn't. And so he climbed a tree in order that he could catch view of the Savior. And his name was Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And the reason that people hated tax collectors was this. They were responsible for collecting the taxes that you owed and giving those taxes to the governing authority. But they had the right to charge you whatever they wanted to charge you above that which you actually owed. And they would often just rip people off in crazy, immoral ways. Because as much money as they could take from you on top of what you owed, they got to keep. And people hated them for it because they were getting rich by impoverishing those who'd done the work. Zacchaeus was hated by everyone, as was every other tax collector, for good reason. And so Zacchaeus is up in the tree. And Jesus is teaching all these people who are trying to learn more about him. And Jesus looks up and he sees Zacchaeus in the tree. And he walks over to the foot of the tree and says, Zacchaeus, would you come down here? And Zacchaeus comes down the tree and he stands before Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, I'd like to come over to your house tonight. I'd like to eat with you and I'd like to stay with you. And everybody just flipped out in that moment. They were so incensed and so angry that someone who would call himself rabbi and teacher and holy one and even Messiah would say, I'm going to go and eat with you and I'm going to stay with you, because that's not what people did. Because it was like their unholiness would wash off on you. It's like they had the unholy sinful cooties, and if you touched them, you got them too, and it was over, right? So they didn't do that, and they didn't like that. And so Jesus says to Zacchaeus, I'm going to come over to your house and I'm going to eat with you, and I'm going to stay with you. And as Jesus and Zacchaeus walked, all the people were murmuring and complaining and griping about how bad this was and what a bad idea this was. And Jesus just kind of ignores them. And he says to Zacchaeus this really powerful thing. He says, Zacchaeus, you're a son of Abraham. And you know what he was saying to him in that moment? Zacchaeus, I know that everyone here says you're on the outside. I know that everybody here says you're a sinner and you're wrong and you're not righteous and you're not religious and you don't matter, and they condemn you and they keep you out. But I'm telling you, you're a son of Abraham. And when Jesus used those words, he was saying to Zacchaeus, you're part of the family. You might be the bad sheep, you might have made some mistakes, but I need you to know that the foundation of your life is this. You are not on the outside. That's not the starting point. The starting point for you is you're on the inside. You're part of the family. Zacchaeus, this is your family. You're in the family. And then he turns and he tells the other people who were there, he says, I need for you to know that people like him are the reason that I came. I came for the Zacchaeuses of the world. And I didn't come to condemn them. I came to save them. There was also one day Jesus teaching, while he was teaching in the temple. Some religious leaders, they took a woman into custody who had been caught in adultery, and she had been caught. This was not an accusation. She was guilty. That part isn't up for debate. The law of Moses required that if you were caught in adultery, that you were condemned to death. So the very law of the faith that Jesus proclaimed said that she was supposed to die for what she did. And so the religious leaders were starting to hear Jesus talk about this grace over condemnation thing, and so now they think they've got something that they can condemn him with, so they bring the woman over to him to set a trap. Jesus, they said, the law states that she is condemned to death for what she did. What do you say? And Jesus does this really weird thing in this moment. He just kneels down and he takes his finger and he starts drawing in the dirt. It was awkward. I don't know what he was drawing. I don't know what he was writing. I don't know what he was doing, but they just made this accusation and he just drops to the ground. And can you imagine? And then he stands up and he says, hey, let the first one of you who is without sin cast the first stone. Hey, let the first one of you who hasn't had a mess in your life, you can address this woman's mess by casting the first stone. Go ahead. And then he just goes back down to the ground. And the people, they just stand there. And again, I don't know how long, but eventually all these accusers, they just start walking off. And when they're all gone, Jesus stands up and he looks at the woman and he says, is no one left to condemn you? And she said, no. They've all gone. And he said to her, I don't condemn you either. The law of Moses said she should be condemned to death. And yet Jesus is standing right there and he just says to her, I don't condemn you. I want to tell you one more story. I mean, I could tell you story after story after story, but I want to tell you one more because this one's personal for me and it's a powerful story. It's about the calling of Matthew, the disciple. Not like the disciple. I mean like the disciple, right? Matthew. His job? He's a tax collector. We've already gone over that, right? So you know his status in the world. Jesus is walking along. He sees Matthew sitting behind his tax collector booth. He says, Matthew, follow me. And not like, follow me. Like, follow me. Jesus is calling him as a disciple. Matthew gets up, leaves everything, starts to follow Jesus. You know where they go? They go back to Matthew's house. And Jesus says, hey, I want you to invite everybody you know over because we're going to have a celebration of your call and you're answering that call. I want you to invite everybody you know over and we're going to have a feast and a party. And so Matthew invites everybody that he knows over to his house. And guess what? Everybody that he knows is either a tax collector or a sinner. Because he doesn't know anybody in the church. Because the church would never let him come. And so he invites everybody he knows. It's all tax collectors and sinners. And so they come over to his house. They sit down. Jesus is with them and they're eating. And the religious leaders find out what's going on. And they do not handle it well. And so they show up and they ask Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? What is with this guy? And they weren't talking to Jesus, but Jesus heard them. And Jesus responded by saying, hey, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And there's such a danger in how you interpret this passage. Jesus didn't mean that they were so perfect and okay that they didn't need help. That's not what Jesus was saying here. Because if you read the whole story of Jesus, you know he had plenty of things to say about the religious leaders, right? They were far from perfect. But here's what he's saying. Have you ever met someone who is so certain of their own self-righteousness, right? I mean, they know they're right. And there ain't nothing you can say to change them. Have you ever changed that person's mind? Ever? No. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is like, look, if you don't think you're sick, if you don't think you need me, then my trying to teach you is like spitting in the wind. Because if you don't think you need me, I can't convince you that you do. And so what Jesus is saying here is he's saying, hey, if you think you're so righteous that you're all good, I'm not going to spend my time with you because you're not going to listen anyway. I'm going to talk with those who know they're sick, those who know they need a physician. Right? That's what he's saying here. Then he says to him, I want you to go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This is a passage from the prophet Hosea, and he's lifting this passage because the prophet Hosea was dealing with some religious leaders who were into idolatry, the oppression of the poor. They were doing all kinds of sinful things. And you know what they did in order to be made right with God? They killed animals. They sacrificed animals, which was not good, especially for the animals. Right? But that's what they did because they believed that in sacrificing the animals, they were made clean. And what Jesus was saying to them, that's not how this works. You can't just go and sacrifice animals and be okay. You've actually got to develop a sense of mercy. You don't just get to go oppress people and be cruel to people and then kill a bird and be okay. Don't do that. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And then he says this, I love this. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. When I was in my ministerial training and was in one of my early positions, and I was presiding over communion, and I told this story about a brokenness for me, a weakness, a place where I had messed up. And how I'd worked through that, and how the grace of the table showed me that you can work through that and find healing and hope. And so I told this kind of raw story, but it wasn't a big deal. But it was an honest deal, right? And after it was over, this guy, this leader in the church, pulls me aside and he says, hey, I need to tell you something. He said, you shouldn't do that. If you're going to be a leader in the church, you can't stand before the people who are trying to get their faith right and talk about how weak you are and how broken you are and the mistakes that you make, because the church needs strong leaders. The church needs to believe in its leaders, because if its leaders can't do what Jesus is asking them to do, then how can they ever expect to do what Jesus is asking them to do? If you're going to be a leader in the church, you've got to be strong. And even if you have weaknesses, you can't talk about those weaknesses, because we need someone to look up to and someone to follow. That's what it takes to be a minister. And I thought, well, if that's what it takes to be a minister, then I'm in trouble. And as I've worked through that and thought about that conversation, because it's just never left me, I think about this story of the calling of Matthew. And I realize that guy, he just had it wrong. You see, the reason that I'm qualified to stand here before you as pastor is because Jesus didn't come to call the righteous, but to call sinners. And I'm among the worst of them, just like you are. You see, here's the thing, because it takes a sinner to know a sinner. It takes a sinner to understand the brokenness, the hurt, and the pain that can come from the messes that we cause in our lives. And I'm not saying, and Paul says this too, this doesn't mean we go out there and sin just so that grace can abound. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the reason I know the pain of your own struggle is because I've been there too. It takes a sinner to know a sinner. It takes a sinner to understand the brokenness of sin and the pain of it. But you know what? It also takes a sinner to know the grace of redemption. Every single person in the story that we've talked about this morning, and in all the other stories that I could have told you, after they received the grace from Jesus, you know what happened in their lives? They became among the most devoted followers and disciples of Jesus in the entire Bible. You see, up to that point, the church, you know how they tried to convince people that they needed to be part of the church, they needed to be part and to follow God, that they had to be holy and they had to be perfect, and people that weren't, they were shamed and exiled and excluded and all that stuff. It was like conversion by shame, fear, and condemnation. And guess what? It didn't work. That's why God sent Jesus. Not to condemn the world, but to save the world. And it still doesn't work. When we carry the mantle of condemnation as though condemnation is what's going to call people into grace, we don't understand the call of the gospel, because that's not the call of the gospel. The call of the gospel is to meet the messes of the world with the greatest grace that's ever been offered. That's the message here. You know, sometimes I wonder how it is that we got it so wrong when it comes to this. But it's not too late for us to start getting it right. My hope for us as a people of faith is that we can get to that place where we understand that it's okay to be broken. That we understand that the church is a safe place for the people who've done. Here's the thing. You know, I think people who are broken, they think the church isn't for them because it's not their church, because they're not good. But this is what I'm telling you. The church, this is their church. The church was made for the broken. The church exists for the broken. Jesus would say today, if you're righteous and you're taken care of, you don't need the church. Because there's nothing the church can tell you that's going to bring you closer to God. The church isn't for the righteous because the righteous don't need a physician. And even if they do and they don't confess it, they're never going to be made well. You know who needs a physician? I do. The church belongs to the broken. And if the righteous in the church keep keeping the broken out, we will never fully answer the call of God for what it means to address the mess in people's lives. So here's the other thing you need to know about Jesus. He loved these people too much to leave them there. He didn't leave them in their mess. And next week we're going to talk about how we get out of the mess and how Jesus tells us to do that. But we can't talk about how to get out of the mess until we talk about we got to deal with our own messes, and we got to talk about this idea that Jesus didn't come to condemn but to save. Because we're not going to get anyone through their messes if we condemn them for the mess that they're in, including ourselves. So may we be a people who shed condemnation, who receive grace, and who share it openly, just as Jesus would have us do. Amen.